The Marvel Snap devs finally nerfed the strongest card in the entire game. That card, of course, is none other than Blob, who has been acknowledged by the devs to be the strongest card in the entire game prior to this balance change, with only play rate being within the normal range, meaning win rate and cube rate were well above average for a card in this position. This was the strongest card in the game, but how good is it going to be now? Blob's new text makes it a 6-0, and in order to facilitate this change, they whipped out some capabilities that have not been used since the OTA fix to Mobius M. Mobius. They are changing the text on Blob and not just the numbers on the card. What they have done is, instead of eating the entire deck, Blob now eats until he has more than 15 power, or 15 or more, I should say. Now, what that means is that his new maximum power is 34. So that can only happen if you eat up to 14, and then the last card you hit is the Infinite, giving you 20 additional power. His average power with this change looks to be somewhere in the 17 to 21 range. That is what you can reasonably expect from a Blob after this change. I actually think this is a very, very clever way to go about nerfing this card. One, it makes Blob's identity still useful. This is still likely to be the biggest 6-drop in the entire game. This is still a meaningful counter to Darkhawk without obliterating it entirely, and this is still a card that is going to win most of the lanes that it goes in. However, by keeping it in the range of, let's say, 15 to 34, it becomes a card that is much easier to actually deal with. I believe math has shown that roughly 7% of the time it will exceed 30 power, and that is not a lot. As long as this card is in that, I would say, 15 to 25 range, I think Blob is an eminently fair card. 15 especially is actually kind of not what you want out of this guy ever. The two comparisons that I would use for Blob in this form are the Infinite and Devil Dinosaur. When you look at a 5-cost card that could reasonably contest a lane like Devil Dinosaur, maximum 17, usually about 15. When you look at a 6-cost card that you have to sacrifice to play, you get the Infinite at 620. Now, this is obviously not a linear scale because any deck playing the Infinite is really only doing it to either cheat it out or to use the past turn in order to get points on Sunspot and discounts on She-Hulk, so it's less of a downside and more of a game plan. But I do think that this is instructive when examining how strong this card is going to be. Because the closer it gets to 30, the more it becomes strictly lane winning. It's very hard to get a lane above 30, but a Blob that only puts, say, 19 power in the lane on the final turn of the game, that's a beatable card. This also maintains Blob's identity as a card that is a bit of a black box. You don't know how big the Blob you're going to go up against is going to be. Now, I do think there's one other aspect to this nerf that is worth discussing, and that is that this iteration of Blob has a lever on it that can be used to make further adjustments. Part of the reason they had to whip out this OTA text change, a rarity, is because there were not good levers on the previous version of Blob. Now, if they think this is too strong, they can just make 15 14, or 13, or 12. If they think it's too weak, they can make that 15 16, or 17, or 18. But the point is, this card now has a way to be easily addressed if it ever becomes a problem again. I'm happy that this was a quick solution. I'm happy that this got out there as fast as they could possibly get it out there, and I'm interested to see how strong this card still is. My instinct is that now you have to play Blob in decks where you can really high roll the pieces of it. One other thing that this kind of does, though, is make it a little bit better in decks that get your Blob. So, for example, Loki now getting a Blob can be like, okay, mine is going to be like 15 to 18, but theirs might not actually be that much more. And I think that goes a long way towards making the Thanos Lockjaw matchups feel a little more balanced. As far as Thanos Lockjaw, the main culprit here, I think it's probably still going to be good. I do think that this is likely not something that throws Thanos Lockjaw off of the top of the metagame. In light of that, I'd actually like to discuss the card Lockjaw and the card Thanos. A lot of people, when they look at Thanos, they complain it sucks that Thanos isn't a game piece because he's just a guy. You don't ever really play him out there. He's just the guy that gets the stones in your deck. And I think the thing I find objectionable about Lockjaw in the Thanos deck specifically is that it turns the stones into not game pieces as well. They are only vehicles with which to cheat out larger things. It is my opinion that Thanos is most fun when the stones are game pieces, when it is a compelling mid-range deck that uses the stones in a relatively fair way and actually cares about their effects. Right now, if you have a Lockjaw, it doesn't matter what stone you have, it's going in the Lockjaw unless you have other stones that are better fits in the Lockjaw. Oh, you wanted to save that reality stone for something? Why do that when you could make it into Magneto? Oh, you wanted to use that space stone to move something off of the Lockjaw? Too bad, it's the only stone in your hand, it goes in the Lockjaw. So my view is that Lockjaw specifically with Thanos creates a deck that is full of 1s and 6s and is only really able to either high roll or low roll, which is unfun for me personally, and B, a deck that doesn't really care about the card it's built around in a very confusing way. Thanos becomes not a game piece in almost any Thanos deck, which people correctly assess sucks. But Lockjaw makes the stones into ante. They're not game pieces, they're what you ante up in order to win the gambles that the deck becomes. And I think that it is my opinion that Lockjaw and Thanos cannot exist together going forward. I do not think Lockjaw and Thanos have ever done anything good for the metagame, ever. There have been other Lockjaw decks, there have been other Thanos decks, but the two of them, when put together, have only ever been stupid. And I think that that needs to be addressed at some point. It is possible that Blob ends up not being good, or that whole deck ends up falling apart here. I don't know. But what I will say is that I doubt it. And even if that does happen, it's kicking the can down the road for the next time Thanos and Lockjaw make something stupid. So that's my worry. First, I think Blob is still going to be quite good in the Thanos Lockjaw deck. Second, I think Thanos Lockjaw is still going to be pretty good. But even if it isn't, I think that's an interaction that should probably be addressed at some point in the future. I'm a big fan of this one. Destroyer is a card that did not, maybe it needed to get nerfed the first time, but it certainly didn't need to keep that nerf once we started printing things like Blob, now did it? I think this was probably a warranted reversion almost a year ago when they first printed High Evolutionary and High Evolutionary Hulk entered the metagame. Destroyer got nerfed because it was the biggest thing to do. It was almost the proto-Thanos Blob, where you would play a Professor X game plan and then play Destroyer and it would just win a lane. But since then, we have grown so much in terms of the ability of cards to put power on the board. Remember, this was a pre-Darkhawk world even, a pre-Zabu world, a pre-Silver Surfer world. We didn't have those tools then, we do now, and Destroyer losing that point of power looks pretty ridiculous in hindsight. So ridiculous, in fact, that Destroyer getting the point of power back, I don't even think that moves the needle. I'm not going to be playing Destroyer anytime soon, I don't think. One thing this does impact, though, is specifically Nimrod decks, who I think have always been slightly underrated. Shuri, Nimrod, Destroyer is now like, okay, that's like kind of useful. And a lot of things like that are useful, but sort of fall behind when you look at just how big a card Blob actually is. And so, for that reason, I don't think this really moves the needle. I do think that it is likely that a lot of things will still get overshadowed by Thanos Blob, but I do like that Destroyer gets his point of power back because there was no reason for him to lose it in the first place. Well, we already covered that. It's not really true. You can justify it at the time, but there was no reason for it to be like this for this long. Viper is getting a little buff, and I think that's good. One of the things that's really stuck out to me in recent Marvel Snap is without the scalers in the game, just how weak 3-cost cards tend to be. Like, there are very few 3-cost cards that you can reasonably count on to give you even 6 or 7 power, which is weird when you consider that there are 4-cost cards that give you 14 power. There's a massive power spike at 4, which has left 3, which is more in line with the sort of vanilla curve, looking a little bit imbalanced. So I think this signifies something good to me, and it's that they're willing to print a 3/5 with upside. Previously, the only card that was like a 3/5 with upside was like Polaris, Spider-Man. It's a design space that needs to be explored more because this 3/5 with upside paradigm is kind of the only way to bring 3 in line with how strong the other energy costs in this game are. I don't know exactly how much this moves the needle, but I will tell you I am way more inclined to care about this card now that it is an actual body that can impact a lane than I ever was before at its previous cost or the one before that. As a 3/4 or a 2/3, I like the 3/5 cost a lot more. And it's sort of hard to explain exactly why because it's a sort of intuitive feeling. But my feeling is that there is a threshold that cards cross where they can actually threaten winning a lane or be a significant part of it. And 3 points or 4 points doesn't cross that threshold. But once you start talking about 5, 6, 7, suddenly that is a card that, maybe you get some help from a Miss Marvel or a Doctor Doom. Maybe you do something else with it. But like suddenly that is a card that can be part of a cohesive game plan that involves winning a lane. And I think that is important in the context of this card. Am I going to play this? I don't really know. I personally think most junk decks are not very good, and Viper herself is one of the worst pieces of the junk decks because of how dependent she is on having a good target in the lane and because of how bad it is when you draw her late. That said, they definitely made this card better, and I'm glad they're playing around in this design space. This is one of 2 cards in Marvel Snap that I do not own, alongside Howard the Duck. I saw no need to purchase Seline, as she was not a meaningful addition to her own Annihilus archetype at her previous power. Now, I'm thinking I probably will end up looking into her, and that is a little bit interesting because it brings me to an important topic in Marvel Snap right now, and that is the role of buffs and nerfs and their interaction with the economy. Now, to be clear, I do not think this makes Seline a must-buy, a must-get, or anything like that, but it does make her a lot more interesting than she was on release. A lot of players who might have picked her up at this power did not pick her up at her previous power when she was released. This feels like a no-win situation, right? They don't make as much money as they otherwise would because she wasn't exciting when she released. And we don't have the option to go back in time and spend caches on her because, well, she's not in any of the caches anymore. So she becomes the kind of card you can only pick up if you saved up enough tokens. And is she really worth that? I don't really know. And so what I'm getting at here is that this highlights a weakness in the way card design and balance mixes with the economy of Marvel Snap. In this case, Seline is a card that could have been exciting released here, but wasn't, so they get less sales, and we get to play less Seline. That's a lose-lose. However, the flip side here is that if they push this card and she ends up too strong and they have to nerf it, well, that's even worse. So you end up in this weird situation where there's no way for the economy to correct for this. And one of the things I've been thinking about is, and I saw this proposal, I believe, from Raven on Twitter, but I don't actually know, what if you could get any of the cards from the month out of the Spotlight caches and they were released in the same order, but you could still go back, like, let's say the last 4 and go for those cards? And I think that might actually make things a lot easier if they're going to be doing balance like this. It's not even asking for a full refund or anything like that. It's just saying, like, look, if you're going to be going back and doing balance like this, there is a massive incongruity between that and the availability of these cards, because most people are not going to be spending 6,000 tokens on this, but they might have some caches they can throw at it. And I think that would be one way of making it so that, hey, they could actually make some money on this card by making it better later. And B, we could actually play with this card without relegating it only to the kind of whales who have 6,000 tokens lying around for something that is fundamentally not that exciting. Let's get back to Seline, though. I am interested in this card a little bit more than I previously was because I am someone who enjoys playing the card Green Goblin. Seline goes from a card that synergizes, in theory, with some Annihilus stuff, which she didn't, to a card that you can now include in any deck running Green Goblin, and she ends up being like a big boost to that card. She's a great card to curve into any of the goblins. You can curve her into like Hood in your Annihilus decks, but I don't think that's where she makes sense. I think she goes in goblin decks and things along those lines. And I do think that it's possible she's good enough in Annihilus decks now, but you're probably going to want to play something that you are able to send to your opponent with some reasonable consistency and not just when Annihilus gets into your hand. This is actually like a pretty compelling card for me now. Because it is a real body, you can bounce it and not feel bad about it. And because it is not something that is hurting you outright and becomes instead something that can sincerely help you, she is a more interesting card right now. I don't know if she makes the cut in anything good. I am tempted to say that she probably does not. But she has a real role now, and I think that's a good thing. I talked about this when Martyr got buffed. Previously, she was indistinguishable from Ant-Man. Previously, Seline was indistinguishable from, like, garbage, and now she is a card. And I think that gives her an actual role, even if it is a niche one. I think that's a good thing. This is a slick buff. I actually enjoy just chopping the energy off of Dazzler. She goes from a 3-2 to a 2-2, keeps the exact same text, and becomes something of like a half mojo that you have more control over. And I think that's a pretty interesting role for her. I often say that costing 2 is a superpower. There are very few 2-drops that will reasonably get to like the 2-8 range, and that is what this card can do. That said, I don't know of many decks that are going to be doing it enough for it to make sense, but there are some instant slot-ins for Dazzler that I do kind of like. For example, I don't know why I wouldn't play this in a Patriot Ultron deck at this point, or a Patriot Brood deck, really. Like, this is the kind of card that maybe it's your 2-drop in Silver Surfer now. If you're playing Brood and Absorbing Man, maybe that makes sense. There are things that this card can do as a 2-cost card that it simply cannot as a 3. And I think it's good to move it into that range because it's a cool card. There's a $10 bundle available for it right now on the Marvel Snap store that's like good value. And I think it's a good thing to just generally take cards that are overlooked like Dazzler and see if just making them a little bit cheaper could make them a little bit better. And I think Dazzler is a card that I find unlikely to be a major threat in any metagame. At best, it ends up as fixed Angela, and I don't think it gets there, but that is its best upside. And I think that that is a reasonable place for it to be. A card that is significantly worse, not necessarily significantly worse, but like not overwhelmingly exciting. At best, 8 power, but 2-8 is a good ratio if you can fulfill the conditions consistently, and it will only be held back by the fact that it is relatively unlikely that you fulfill those conditions consistently. That said, I think this is a much more exciting card than it previously was. There are going to be decks where I am now considering, oh, can I fit Dazzler in here? If they nerf Lockjaw, can I be a Dazzler Thanos deck? Does that make sense? How do we make that happen as much as possible? What about if I'm playing a Mysterio Hitmonkey deck? Isn't this just like a 2-8 in there? That's exciting. And I think that's actually where I think she fits the most, is something like a Sarah Mysterio Hitmonkey. I'm filling up all the spaces on the board, and she is going to be a 2-8 when I do. That's the kind of thing that makes sense to me with this card. That, maybe some Silver Surfer Brood abs, things of that nature, make her seem a lot more exciting to me personally. But I think her number one use case is likely to be in those sort of Hitmonkey, Beast, Sarah, discount, Mysterio type decks just as a 2-8. And I think that's a really good place for her to be. She could end up being legitimately powerful in that shell, especially with that 1 energy discount, because Sarah is actually part of the reason why cards that cost 2 are so good. A 1 energy discount on a 2-cost card is a 50%er. 1 energy discount on anything that costs more than 2, less than 50% discount. 2-cost cards, great with Sarah. I do think that ends up being the kind of deck she goes in, a late game, fill the board, explosion type deck. And I'm glad that kind of archetype is getting a little bit of support because we've been on a very priority and big guys meta for a while now. It'll be nice to see if some little guys can fight together, band together and fight these dangerous, gigantic blobs. Hercules getting a 1 power buff. It is abundantly clear at this point that Hercules released a little too weak, and while I do think there are some compelling lists playing him, most of them feel a little bit high rolly. I do think the best of the lists playing Hercules right now is a move bounce list that is looking to play things like gigantic human torches, some multiple men, Heimdall, and of course Vulture and Hercules, alongside a bounce package of Beast and Falcon to repeat things like Human Torch, Ghost Spider, Nico Minoru, and Iron Fist. Hercules in that deck is sort of not required for it to be in any way functional. It's very much a kind of high roll combo deck, but I do think the Hercules change is a significant and useful one for that deck because getting a bit of extra guaranteed power can help you win those games where you're not popping off, at least in theory. When I've played that deck, it feels like I'm either popping off or I'm doing nothing. And so I don't think that this moves the needle so much on a deck like that, but it is a good thing that this card is now at a very competitive stat line. I'm a big fan of pushing the needle on 4-cost cards because of their high level of competition. Think about the other 4-cost cards that this has to compete with. Darkhawk, for example, is anywhere from like a 4-8 to like a 4-18, depending on how much disruption has happened, or a 4-0 if they play a Blob, but that's neither here nor there. And then you look at things like White Queen at 4-6, who probably has a better effect than Hercules at 4-7, and so it looks a little balanced in that context as well. I think that this is probably the right power for the guy. I know a lot of people, myself included, have suggested that he ends up cheaper, but I am actually compelled by the dev explanation for why they wanted to make him a 4-cost card instead of a cheaper one, despite the fact that a cheaper one is likely to be stronger. And the answer they gave was that they wanted to have move cards that were effective at different spots on the curve. So this is their attempt at making a good 4-cost move card. One bit of feedback for the devs, if any are watching this video, the way to make Hercules a better card is to stop him from only working once per turn. This is also a warning to anyone who ends up looking to get this card now, because he only works once per turn. This is really important, and it's not once per turn on your cards and your opponent's cards. If your opponent moves a vision in there, you will not get the Hercules effect. I think that is a bad thing, and if they removed that and made him a sort of permanent card mover outer, he would be a much more compelling card. What that card would do would be allow Heimdall to be a lot more unpredictable. That's really important stuff in a move deck that's biggest weakness is predictability. Now, maybe they didn't want to make a card that good for a move deck. Maybe they didn't want to make Heimdall Hercules, guess where the power goes, a big part of the metagame. And if that is part of the reason, I totally understand. It doesn't sound like the most fun thing ever, but it would be different. And that is, I suppose, probably worth talking about. Hercules also brings us back to what we discussed with Seline. This card just left Spotlight caches, which is the way that the vast majority of Marvel Snap players acquire cards. And because it is no longer in Spotlight caches, a lot of people won't get them. It's another one of those worst case scenario situations where they don't make the money they could have if they made this change earlier. And that sucks. And we don't have the access to this card that we would have if we made this change earlier. And that sucks. And I think that that is a tough situation to deal with, but it is the reality of the situation. And frankly, I don't know what they could have done better about this, because the alternative to doing this is just let him suck forever and stop making these cards desirable in retrospect. And I think that's worse. The main issue, as always, is accessibility of these cards, which I do think would be fixed, at least nominally, if we had the ability to go back maybe the last 4 weeks and spend caches on the cards that have previously come out. I think that would be an interesting functionality to investigate. I think it would alleviate some of this FOMO BS that we see, and it wouldn't even require them offer refunds, which, obviously would impact their bottom line. This would be a way to do that without even having to impact their bottom line. I would wager it would even make money for them as people go back and spend their caches on newly buffed cards like Hercules. I think that's a win-win proposal, and I'm really excited to try to see if we can get that to percolate upwards to the devs. Lord knows I will try to get that information to them and at least see if they can consider it. As far as Hercules himself, I don't think this changes the decks that he goes in. I do think that that move combo bounce deck is actually pretty scary when it works. Their snaps are very threatening, but it's a very hard deck to play. And knowing when you're going to snap with it is difficult because you have to know all these intricate mechanics. It's a deck that you can mess up very easily because it requires both move and bounce mechanic knowledge, and there's a lot of weird arcane BS in move and bounce mechanics that you kind of have to wrap your head around before you play it. So I'm not worried about it becoming overwhelmingly powerful, but I do think this is a solid buff to an archetype that was flying under the radar, but probably not there yet, and I think that's a good thing. Speaking of buffing an archetype that is flying under the radar, but probably not there yet, Dagger is by far the weakest of the move payoff cards. Human Torch, stronger by virtue of being a 1-cost card and scaling more heavily, and Vulture, stronger by virtue of not having to invest too much into him. He just ends up becoming a solid guy if you move him even once or twice. Dagger is much more dependent on what your opponent is doing, and now she's even more dependent on that with the additional upside of getting enormous. This card, if you move it a couple times, is going to be one of the biggest things you have ever seen in your entire life. And one thing that I think move players are going to have to start looking out for if that deck ever really picks up is Shadow King's going to ruin your life, but it'll ruin Dagger and Human Torch more than it'll ruin anything else. Because those are the cards that get completely enormous, and boy, are they going to shrink if you are counting on them. One thing I do think this might do for the move archetype is that it adds a second real hard carry in addition to Human Torch. However, because of your desire to keep these cards on the field, they tend to be vulnerable to tech cards, Shang-Chi and Shadow King chief among them, and that does mean that they end up in an awkward spot. That said, I'm happy to see it. Move is a deck that is so sort of face up in its early turns and then so unpredictable on the final turn because of the threat of the Heimdall. It's the only deck that can really rival the turn 6 threat of, say, a Blob or an Goliath with not playing one of those cards. And I think that that is a fun thing to have in the game when it's not Blob or Goliath, to be clear. And I do think that move is an archetype that I'm not unhappy to see get this help. Obviously, however, I am a little bit worried that this sort of small ball move bounce type thing has another really strong tool, and I am interested to see just how strong it can become as it morphs into something that is more like a good deck and less like a combo deck. I wonder if a package of move cards and some tech ends up being the way to go. Obviously, I don't know, but that's sort of where my head is at. Can we play this as a smaller scaling threat that just provides enough points rather than hyper investing in it? Or is this just a card that we only ever hyper invest in? Because I'm more interested in playing it as a smaller scaling threat and a smaller move package. When you think about it, like if they have a full lane and you play this card in Ghost Spider, that's 14 power, 2 from the Ghost Spider, 12 from this, for 3 energy. That seems like a pretty compelling thing to do just generally. And so if you're not fully invested in move and you don't have to play like Doctor Stranges and stuff, you can just play like a smaller move package with Dagger and Vulture in a sort of mid-rangey Shang-Chi type deck. And suddenly I'm a little more interested in the archetype as a whole. That's sort of where my thought process is at, because I know most people are going to see this and just be like, oh, I'll play move combo with Heimdall. But this is actually pretty interesting just on its own, and I don't want that to get overlooked. This card gets big as hell, especially if people are going to be filling the board like they do in Thanos decks. Finally, a buff to Electra. Electra going to 1/2, a mild buff. I know people have been proposing various changes to Electra to make her better or more competitive, but I think she's a hard card to do that with because of the lessons she teaches an early player, specifically with regards to cards like Ant-Man and how priority works. Electra is your first introduction to why your cards flipping up matters and why that order actually is important to you. And so for that reason, I don't think I liked many of the proposals that saw her going to like, oh, she'll kill a 2-cost now. And it's like, okay, that would have made sense 3 to 4 months ago when Mobius cost 2 and Elsa was a massive threat and Angela was everywhere. Then that makes sense. Right now, that doesn't make sense. That's just not what you need. 2-cost cards aren't doing what they were back then, and making her cost 2 wouldn't actually do anything to make her more playable at endgame. It would just be like, oh, cool, and then we wouldn't play her because there's nothing to hit. Now, keeping her here, yeah, she's still going to be kind of the same card, but if there's not a burning need to change her, I don't see why you would. And so I'm glad that Electra is going to get a little bit of a buff in power. I'm glad that they didn't overreact and try to push her to be an endgame card. I think it's good the role she inhabits on the early game collection track. I think she's a good card there. And she, like, I lost to an Electra in High Infinite recently. I don't want to talk about it, but I did. Like, I think that Zoo has been slowly getting these buffs in such a way that I am more interested in the deck consistently. And Electra's a great card in that archetype because you are almost always going to hit something, and now she has an actual decent stat line. I think what this actually does is kind of make a lot of the one-drops that, like, suck, or not necessarily suck, but, like, have a mildly beneficial effect at 1-2, kind of look pretty bad. Like, I like this card right now. I'm not saying I'd play it, but I'm saying I'd consider it, and I think that's an upgrade. I am a little more interested in cards like this than most people are, but I do think that this is a card that is a reasonable card now. It's good that she got the buff, and I'm glad they didn't overreact. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it to the end of that video. I know that was a long one. I was definitely on one for this episode. I had like 8 minutes of Blob Thanos ranting. I'm aware. I'm distinctly aware. I was definitely on one here. I apologize for the extended length. But I had a lot to say. I had a lot to get off my chest. And I think coming out of this, there are 2 things that I want to express, worry about. The first is the combination of Thanos and Lockjaw. It sucks. Please get rid of one of these cards. Like, I don't know a better way to say it. I hate that Lockjaw turns the entire card Thanos into non-game pieces. I hate it so much. I hate that the Lockjaw Thanos decks are always built around high rolling. Like, say what you want about the Prophex Eliath Thanos decks. Those decks were bad because of Prophex and Eliath, not because of the Thanos stuff. At least when you were playing a Thanos deck in that era, the stones mattered. They were game pieces. You played them for priority to do things with. You played the game of Marvel Snap. You didn't play Marvel Lockjaw. And I hate playing Marvel Lockjaw, so I would like to get rid of that. I do think that, like, in other decks, Lockjaw is not this gamble that it is in Thanos. Like, in a dedicated Lockjaw deck, I think that card is fine to exist, but specifically in Thanos with the 1s and 6s deck building, and it's like, oh, I either pull a stone or I pull Magneto here. Great. I love that. That's awesome. And I just, it sucks. And I am very concerned about the future because it has only ever been stupid. Thanos Lockjaw has only ever been stupid or unplayable. Much like Lockjaw itself. Like, this card only shows up to do something stupid and then goes away. And I just don't think that's a healthy pattern for a card to be in. I just don't like it. I even more don't like it because of what it turns Thanos into. I want Thanos and his stones to matter, and the Lockjaw Thanos deck, they matter just the absolute least. Now, the other concern I have is, of course, the intersection of balance and monetization. I've talked at length about this, but I will reiterate my points one more time. The balance team, I think, is doing a phenomenal job of fixing whatever mistakes they make. I think it is great that they fix their mistakes as soon as they possibly can. However, because of the way cards are acquired in Marvel Snap, those fixed mistakes end up engendering more mistakes. And this sort of, like, it stacks. It, like, goes exponential because people just run out of money to get the good card when it's good. And then a new card shows up that's, like, better, and the good card gets nerfed. And it's like, well, what did I spend my money on? And that pattern can spiral. Right now, I think Blob is still good. And I honestly think I am a little bit impressed that they ended up at a text that kept Blob still good. I'm actually worried Thanos Blob is still the best deck in the game. And I think it's good that they erred on the side of that, because otherwise it would just be this never-ending cycle of just like, oh my god, this card I bought sucks now, and now I have to go buy something else to keep up with the metagame, and I hate that. I think it sucks. And I would be I will say I'm encouraged by this, and I think one thing that people need to understand, especially people that watch my videos, is if I say a card is too strong, understand that there is a decent chance it's going to get nerfed. Like, that's just the reality we have to live in. If I think this card is good as hell, there's a pretty good chance it's going to get got. Now, if I think a card is not good, by the same token, there's a pretty good chance it's going to get better. And I think this goes to what I suspect their ideology is. They want you to buy the cards that you like and then worry about them making them good later. And I think that that is questionable for a lot of people that, you know, watch what I do, want to win, want to do all that thing. But it is an interesting way to approach it. And I do think there are some significant upsides to the way in which balance is done in this game. The issue, of course, is monetization. When people have to go out and get the new shiny thing, and then the new shiny thing, and then the new shiny thing, that's bad. It's not a good thing. And I hope that we are sort of done with this new shiny thing monetization model as reasonably as we can be, because it's been a bit of a slog these last 4 months chugging through broken stuff. I think Blob is still probably an outlier. I think Miss Marvel is still probably an outlier. But I do get the sense that we've finally gotten to a point where we can calm down. And I'm hopeful that's true, because going from thing to thing has been genuinely exhausting. Thank you so much for watching. I've been KM Best. You've been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one. I hit the mic.